This is an exciting time to work in change management activities. So people that are new to consulting or developing their skills, coming into the change management OCM world and training world, this is a great time to come in because a lot of the battles have been fought with leadership in many companies. Quite honestly, it's viewed as a necessity now.
This is the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell and Associates, a Newport Beach, California-based ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. The ERP OCJ seeks to share expertise, insight, experience, and research, and to create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success. And now, here's your co-host Jonathan Donald, founder of the change management firm Invert Ventures, and your ERP expert and host, the founder of Nestell and Associates, Dr. Jack Nestell.
In today's episode, we will discuss ERP Organizational Change Success Factors with Mr. David Amborski. David is the Vice President of Enterprise Learning Solutions at TrainingPros, where he is responsible for the development and management of Training as a Service, or TaaS. David has over 40 years of industry experience and has led and provided quality assurance management, project oversight on over 20 enterprise resource planning ERP transformations and their related consulting engagements. David is recognized as an expert in both organizational assessment, process assessments, and employee skill development. He's been a guest lecturer for the process improvement course at several universities, and he's also certified in lean manufacturing and holds a Six Sigma Green Belt certification. Jack, I'm excited to have David on the show today.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I'm looking forward to this interview as well. This is going to be a fun conversation with David. So let's dive in. As Jonathan mentioned, David is Vice President of Enterprise Learning Solutions at TrainingPros, where he helps manage, quote, the TaaS service offering is intended for companies and organizations that have implemented and are actively using one of the major enterprise resource planning software packages to run their business. The TaaS methodology focuses on ongoing maintenance and improvement of courseware and system documentation post-go live of the system. The TaaS approach can be used by organizations that have developed a center of excellence or a solution center approach, or those that have chosen a different ongoing maintenance strategy. I'm looking forward to having David share his 40 years of great experience regarding ERP success factors, Jonathan. And please note that we will deliberately be asking and sharing questions that we have asked other ERP and organizational change professionals as well by sharing and comparing experiences. And our show notes will include links to those other great guests as well. David will share with us his definition of ERP success, ERP challenges and success rates, keys on project management, reasons for ERP failure, the role of organizational culture, the value of effective learning and development, or L&D, change readiness, and more. So let's get started. Joining us from Canton, Georgia, David, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jack, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit this afternoon.
David, welcome. As a way to really dive in, can you please tell us a bit more about yourself? What's the bio behind the intro?
Yeah, I've had a very interesting career. I started out working for the IBM company and worked my way through manufacturing and manufacturing engineering and got involved literally in the change process and training process through that experience because I noticed as I worked in manufacturing, things were not always going smoothly in it. And it was always the people that were getting blamed for the problems when, in fact, some of it was poor engineering or poor specifications and things. So I got kind of involved in that and then went on to work in the ERP arena and kind of thrived in that area as well because I liked working with the new systems and we kind of focused on factory of the future kinds of projects. And that's where I got involved with lean manufacturing and instructing on that and doing greenbelt work as well.
Fantastic. And David, I'm really excited to get your insights over the 40 years of ERP experience for our listeners. So David, how would you define ERP?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, many people talk about how enterprise-wide software works, but few people really understand the impact that it has on an organization and on the people that have to use it. And ERP really is taking all aspects of the business and centralizing them in a way that you only have one form of the truth when it comes to the data that comes out of the system, and all of the system components talk to one another and make it much easier and eliminate so many mistakes. So ERP is really centralizing the computing system so that it helps to guide the business, not necessarily run the business.
One form of the truth. I like that.
I do as well. That's great, great insight and a great definition. So, David, suppose you're leading a kickoff meeting for an organization that is just starting an ERP implementation. How would you define and describe for them, quote unquote, success in terms of an ERP organizational change effort?
Supporting a kickoff meeting is one of the most important parts of organizational change that takes place on a project, because it sets the tone for the way the project is going to run over a period of time. And as we know from the literature, some of the system implementations run 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. I've been on projects for 3 years in my past. And so the kickoff meeting really sets the tone for how things are going to operate. And the most important thing that I try to describe to the people when I do part of the kickoff, because they get inundated with technical information and with process information, and then I get up and I tell them, the most important part of the process is going to be you, because you're the one that has to embrace the system.
Yep.
And so success in my mind is determined not by the day you go live, but by the way you adopt the system and sustain it.
Well said. Great point.
David, I love the overt attention to people you gave in that answer. And I think this is really critical as we get into our next question. David, how would you describe your general understanding of ERP organizational change success rates based on your own work? How good a job is the industry doing at achieving success?
I think overall, at this stage of the game, I think that the success rates of implementations are much better than they were early on in ERP's introduction to business. And I think one of the basic good things that has come out of it is that people recognize that the people side of the business is also an important factor. And I stressed that when I answered the last question, and I'm very passionate about that the technology has grown tremendously and functionality has grown tremendously. And the success of the software has been highly recognized around the world. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of companies that run their businesses on the software. So we know the technology is good and it works. We know that process reengineering has been very successful because we've benchmarked people and we've done different things to get the best processes wrapped into the software. So the thing that was still on the table and was always an issue and caused failures in the beginning was the people competency. And many people would talk about knowledge transfer to people in these enterprise-wide implementations, but it's not just the knowledge transfer. I like to tell people what we really need to do is transfer capability to the people. And capability transfer is taking the knowledge that one gains about how the new process works or the software works and translates it into somebody being able to do something on their job in a better way, in a more productive way. And I think that's where the success rates over the last few years, probably since the Y2K times, right, which is now 20 years ago, right? It's really because of people's emphasis on people and not necessarily on the technology or the process.
Yeah, that's well said, David. I like that. We often discuss the triad of ERP organizational change, people, processes, and technology. And I couldn't agree more with you in terms of the people piece. And in that organizational training is one thing, but then that transfer of knowledge, to the workplace and effective and efficient learning and development is just as critical. And in fact, I would argue that that's a pretty significant piece of any organization's success. Great point. So, David, from your experience implementing ERP, what would you say are the most critical aspects of ERP implementation in terms of project management specifically? So, if you had to kind of take a step back and look at the project management piece, so the tactical process of project management, what would you say are some of the critical aspects?
I would say the most critical aspect of it is change management, not in the sense of the OCM, but managing the changes that might take place midstream in a project where you are on a path to do a certain process a certain way or implement a certain aspect of functionality. And then you come to find out that it's not going to work very well when it gets to preliminary testing, and you have to make some sort of a change in how the ERP package is going to be implemented. And some people kind of fall on their face a little bit and don't have a good change process or change tracking process to make sure that it's documented why and how they did certain things during the implementation process. And that becomes important at the back end of the project, because invariably somebody's going to come by and say, well, why did you do it that way? And you got to be able to answer some of the questions. And I think project management is very important to manage those changes within the project and get them into documentation, which leads me to my second critical aspect, and that's document everything. One of the things I found through my career in doing 24 plus of these implementations is nobody likes to write, especially the implementers and the programmers. They don't want to write down what they're doing. They just like flipping the switches in the software, and you can't operate that way. You have to document everything because somebody's going to have to fix it eventually if something goes wrong. And you got to have good documentation. The third aspect I would say is you got to have good process mapping so that you can map the process and you can plug in the areas where the software is really enhancing the process and know how that stuff tracks together. And again, that's kind of an extension of documentation, but that's kind of the third leg of the stool, I think.
Yeah, that's several great points there, David. And, the way I think about it in terms of project management, of course, most projects have a project manager, and then you have your technical and functional SMEs or subject matter experts. And of course, the functional SMEs, their primary job is training, right? And like you were saying to the previous, one of the previous questions in your answer, it is about organizational training and transfer of that training and that knowledge. But I think that even the functional SMEs, especially, they're more than trainers. They're educators. They also have to be good project managers, right? So even the functional subject matter experts have to do the little things correctly within project management itself. So like you were saying, the documentation with change management, the meeting minutes, the action items, the follow-up, all of that tactical stuff from all players on your team needs to be well executed.
I agree. And the other thing is that on a project team, you're going to have a training lead and a change management lead, and they are project managers to the main project manager, but they have many, many things they have to keep track of during the creation of the communication plan and strategy, the training plan and strategy, the number of people that are going to work on actually doing the training. How do you get people in classrooms? All of that stuff is very critical to the project.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, David, in your 40 years of experience in this field, I think you said 24 projects, why do you think so many ERP projects fail to deliver on their expectations, both in terms of their implementation and their results?
I think that from my experience, I think many times it comes from the leadership of the company that's implementing, that there are different expectations by different leaders in different parts of the organization on what they're going to get. And in some cases, ERP might be a takeaway for somebody in one part of the organization, but it'll be a great benefit to somebody, say, in finance. And so if the expectations aren't balanced between the leadership team, you'll end up having people that literally can scuttle the project. And I call these people, like when I do leadership alignment meetings with people in a conference room, I try to get everybody on the same page on what we're going to get out of it. And you always have people that will sit there and smile and nod their head and say yes, and yes, that's right. And when they leave the room, they say, boy, I don't want to have any part of this because this isn't going to work for me. So leadership alignment is really one of the things that we need to focus on. And this is one of the lessons I learned through many of the projects, is that you have to get the leaders to agree on what the measurements are and what they're going to get out of the system, and be happy with what they're getting from the system. Because in some cases, some areas of the business, there may be takeaways that change the process in a way that is viewed as a takeaway by its leader. And in some other areas, maybe like finance, they're getting a tremendous amount more data, and it's a real benefit to managing the business. But you find when you do the leadership alignment meetings that you find people that do not respond well to the process, but they'll still sit and nod their head and smile and say, yes, I agree. And then when they leave the room, they are not going to participate. When they do that, they can really kind of scuttle your project. And I call the people that will smile and agree with everything in the meeting room, but then trash the project when they leave. Those are what I call covert agreeers. And they're very difficult to handle that on a project. And if you root them out, you are viewed as somebody that is taking an aim at the client's leadership team. And you have to kind of walk softly around that, but it's something that needs to be handled on the project, or the projects will fail.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dave. And I think you're talking about, obviously, been there, done that. And, that's a real world thing, right? That you don't often hear a lot of people talking about in the context of ERP organizational change, but it is something that needs to be managed well, and it needs to be visible. And there needs to be, the leadership needs to have awareness of that point, because it is a real thing. And there's things you can do to mitigate and to manage that. Sometimes that type of feedback and understanding why people take that position is important, because that could give you insight into potential issues. But, then you hear other people say, which is probably true, that you got to work through that. But at some point, maybe you're on the bus or you're not. So I think there's that line, and it is a bit of an art, but that's a real issue that you bring up. And so thanks for that point. That's very insightful. David, I know this is a loaded question, but when you talk about the leadership and this idea of managing the team, really has a lot to do, I think, with corporate culture. But what role does corporate culture play in ERP organizational change, and why?
This is a great follow-on question, because it's the epitome of what I just talked about from a leadership standpoint, right? The leadership is a byproduct of the corporate culture, right? They've been developed and they've grown through the ranks in whatever culture the company has. And it's one of the early things that you try to establish on an OCM part of the project is, what does the corporate culture look like? How are people going to accept the changes? What are the hot spots, the areas and things that people absolutely are taboo, that they don't want to do, that that they're going to have to do? But you got to figure out ways so that you can communicate with them and you can change the culture somewhat. And you're not going to change the culture totally on an ERP project, but there are some areas that you may have to focus on, because that the culture demands that you do change it, because they won't accept the new way of doing business if you don't. And so it's very important to understand the culture of the company when you're doing the ERP implementation.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times the culture can be very abstract, right? And difficult to measure and hard to see. But again, it's a real thing that needs to be understood and managed.
Yeah, and I have a couple of tools in the book that I wrote on ways of measuring some of the aspects of the culture. And I found them to be very useful to really unlayer some of that stuff. And we try to do that early on in the project so that we can utilize that data to tailor our communication strategy and our approach to things.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our listeners, David is referring to his book, Practitioner's Guide to Change Management. And then we'll also be sure to include a link in our show notes.
So, David, in your experience, what's the most common challenge you face in ERP implementation?
I think that challenge has changed a bit. I think the challenge in the beginning of ERP, when I entered into the arena to play in this game, the challenge was to get anybody to believe that you could measure success of OCM activity. And now I think it's changed for the better, because I think many leaders and middle managers are starting to respect the aspects of change management, and certainly of training, which OCM and training are kind of bonded together. And so I think the challenges now are to keep some of the leadership from trying to move too quickly. It was before they wouldn't move at all or they were slow, and now they want to move more quickly.
David, what about training and learning and development in the organization? I know we briefly touched this in a previous question, but I'd like to dig a little deeper with you. To what extent do you suggest and encourage opportunities for training and learning, and maybe before implementation, during implementation, and post-implementation? Any thoughts on that point?
Yeah, I'm a big supporter of trying to get people in the training and learning mode as fast as possible. Even during the extent of time when the development team is really formulating the functionality that people are going to use, I like to get people hands-on the systems before any of that functionality has even gone to test or been documented. I think introducing people to the system and how they enter data and those kinds of things, I think is extremely important, because it eliminates the first fear factor that people have about using the system. The biggest fear that they have is it's something new and it's scary and they never used it before. It's going to change my job, all those things. Anything you can do to get their hands on it and make it look to them like it isn't the scary dog that's chasing them, I think that's important. So getting them on the system early, using interesting ways of doing learning, like gamification of some of the courseware and making games out of it so that they can practice things on an internet site or on their project site. I did one project where we put some games out on the internet site and people just loved it. I mean, they were out there using it all the time. And it was probably one of the best implementations I've ever worked on, where the people were so ready when it came time for go live that we had a war room set up to catch problems on the days after go live. And we had to shut it down after 3 days because nobody was getting any calls. And so it was a highly successful project. And I also took data on if people used the game system and then they came and took the classes that we had in class for them. We did a correlation between them, and the people that took the games and did them before they came to class did 25% better than the ones that didn't do it. And you can measure some of these things and show leadership that these things are worthwhile.
Well, that's a very nice thing to have a quiet help desk center and support center post go live. So, yeah.
So, David, we're now going to talk about transformational change. And as our listeners may know, this is an area that I really love. You had an article I want to share with our listeners, and we'll tie it in the show notes. Preparing for Transformational Change, a framework for assessing organizational change readiness. And so if I'm talking to a leader and I'm a big believer in change readiness assessments, can you share with our listeners, what is this tool? What does it look like? What is it designed to measure? And how do you present it to leaders?
I think the real success of the readiness assessment is really in presentation that you get to develop from the data that you collect, because the assessment is merely a set of questions that you ask individuals within the organization to answer that gives you an interpretation of what their view is of the coming system and process. And by the answers that they give you, they can be weighted and looked at. You can actually measure. We measured down to the department level in some instances. And when you portray the data, I used to use a heat map, or still use a heat map, with a red, green, and yellow coding on it, and with green obviously being good. And you can plot the departments side by side. And once you plot the data, you can see exactly where in the organization there are holes that you got to fill to do more communication, more work with some of your OCM tools to get people to more embrace the system and the process. So it's the portrayal of the data and the way you present the readiness data that really makes the impact to management. And this goes back to what I said before, where people in the past never thought you could do any kind of analytics around OCM work. But this tool definitely gives you the analytics you're looking for to demonstrate to leadership you're making an impact. So you take a change readiness assessment at the beginning of the project. It's going to look all red, most likely, when you first do it. Then you take it somewhere in the middle of the project and it starts to look yellow-green. And then hopefully you're going to take it at the end of the project and it's going to be green. And so the importance of that is twofold. Number one, you get to show leadership that the organization is ready for the change to be implemented, but it also tells the people, the implementation team, hey, what we're doing is working, right? Our communication strategy, our OCM plan, the way we approach training, those things obviously have worked because people are ready and willing and able to use the system.
Yeah, that was a nice article. And again, for our listeners, we'll be sure to put that in our show notes. Preparing for Transformational Change, a framework for assessing organizational change readiness. I thought that was well done, David. So thank you for that. David, as we'd mentioned, you also have a book called Practitioner's Guide to Change Management. So can you share just in general how change management is being viewed in today's business environment and maybe provide some key points on how to properly guide an effective and efficient change management process? So in other words, to ask that question another way, what value should organizations put in change management and how do you tactically manage that?
As I mentioned before, I think this is an exciting time to work in change management activities. So people that are new to consulting or developing their skills, coming into the change management OCM world and training world, this is a great time to come in because a lot of the battles have been fought with leadership in many companies. Quite honestly, it's viewed as a necessity now. And I think tactical management is something that has to be done because leaders are demanding it. I mean, they want reports on how are our people doing with the new system? How are they handling the knowledge you're giving them? Are our capabilities growing? And you have to be able to measure those things and demonstrate to the leadership because the leadership is asking. There's been several clients that I've visited recently that have just come out and asked me, what are you going to do for me from a change management standpoint? I know I need it. What do I do? And they want to be educated, and the leaders want to be educated as well on how to do it. And quite honestly, I think where you can really tactically manage this is by getting to the leadership team and coaching them in how to use some of the tools and some of the concepts from OCM and training in their own way of conducting business. And I think that's why it's successful now.
David, I love the idea of coaching leaders and helping them see what they don't see. Often I point this out with leaders that change and transformation by its very nature takes away resources from operations. So I want to pull on your experience. How does that facet affect leaders' expectations about conflict during a change process around and in ERP and transformation? Are they expecting a smooth process? And what are their expectations when conflicts arise?
I think for the most part, again, I think things have changed over the years because everybody always thought that the change team and the training team was just a bunch of fun and gamers and that it wasn't important to projects until they really realized that the people really wanted the help at trying to accept some of these things. And I think getting the people to embrace the changes is obviously the most important thing because and I usually in some of my orals presentations with clients, I tell them, you've talked all, and I'm usually the last one to present, right? Because the technology guys go first and then the process guys go and then I go. And when I get up there, I say, well, you've heard how good the technology works and we know it does because there's thousands of companies that use it. You know, the process is going to be good because we're going to make it so, but who's going to breathe life into the system? It's going to be the people that touch the keys. And you got to make sure that they're going to be happy campers by the time we go live. And you got to keep them happy after that, because if they don't adopt the system and keep the adoption moving, then you're never going to be able to make changes and improvements and all those kinds of things. So I think conflicts are less these days. From a leadership standpoint, you still get the conflicts with some of the user groups that are going to use the system, but those are managed out by good communication and good training and making people feel comfortable with the system.
David, I would like to take a second and just back up. You mentioned earlier you were discussing the value of leadership, especially in the context of alignment and setting the tone, I would say, in terms of the organizational culture. But What leadership styles or attributes would you say were most prevalent during the best of your ERP implementation experiences? I know that you've had several successful ERP organizational change projects, and you mentioned the one where your call center was dead silent after go live. So maybe pick on that project, but have you noticed any like common denominators or common themes that you could apply across the different leadership teams? And what would that be?
I think it all comes down to the leaders communicating with the people that are going to use the system, and not just have the OCM person or the training person or even subject matter experts go out and talk to the people about how the system's going to help them, but have the leaders themselves prepare some of the things. I like to have, particularly if I have a newsletter or I have a project website that I have access to, right on the front page of the project website, and I'll use that project I just told you about. The leadership of that organization, we focused on having a different leader every month do a piece on the website and talk about the importance of the system, what it was going to bring to the organization, why he or she felt positive about putting the system in. And it was very powerful because the people saw that the leadership was totally behind it, and it's not just another project or not just another fad. It was fundamentally going to change the business, and it was important to do that. And one of the leaders, and this sticks in my mind, one of the leaders on that project, in fact, the CEO of the organization said this in the opening kickoff for the project. He says, "You have no idea right now how important this is really going to be to our business." And he said, "And think about it. You have the opportunity," he says, "a once in a lifetime opportunity to actually change the course of the place that you're working in." He said, "Many people in their job careers never get that opportunity. And you all are going to be at the heart of the whole thing." And he made people feel so good about the change that was coming that we really had very little problem convincing anybody that it was a good thing.
Some more great insight, David. Thanks. So now I'm actually going to put you on the spot since you've provided such great insight. And I think you've listed several what I would call critical success factors required for successful ERP organizational change. So if you could only choose 4, what would you say were the most critical success factors required of ERP organizational change success? So based on your experience, and especially, obviously, for those promising practice organizations, right? So those that were successful, if you could only list 4 and give me just 4 words, that's it. What would you say are those greatest influences?
I would say leadership commitment, effective measurements of success. I would say realistic timelines for implementation. And the 4th one, I would say, would be preparation for post-go live.
Good ones. And I think just those 4 alone, David, we may have to have you back someday because I think we can talk for an hour just on those 4 points.
Probably so.
Yeah.
I know I can.
Yeah, exactly.
David, if you had to distill down your work and your experience as though you were talking to our listeners directly, and this is everyone from boots on the ground to researchers to private equity executives to people leading organizational transformation, what would you say in words of advice? What would you tell them to be? What would you tell them to look for? And what would you tell them to do?
I think I would tell the leaders to be leaders, don't be managers. And by that, I mean, don't try to manage the system or the people. Be a leader, give them the opportunity to grow, and then let them run and give them guidance and mentor them. The second thing I probably would tell them is make sure that you recognize that the skills that people are gaining by going through this process are very, very important to the success post-go live, and don't allow the skills to be wasted, and make sure that you put in a center of excellence or a competency center and utilize those skills to manage that kind of center. And I think another one would be that leadership needs to remember that unless you're pulling the best people you have out of the organization to work on this project, and it's got to hurt your business to take those people out of their positions, you're putting the wrong people on the job. And if you put the wrong people running the project is going to struggle mightily. and it's important to put the right people on the job.
David, thank you for that insight.
Yeah, thank you, David. And thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate your work. And again, for our listeners, please be sure to check out training-pros.com. That's trainingpros.com. And again, the link and more information will be in our show notes. David, what's the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you?
They can go out to trainingpros.com, and there's a link that they can get in touch with me.
Perfect. That sounds good. Well, David, thank you again. Be well, and we'll talk soon. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the ERP OCJ podcast. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change successes and challenges. We discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change by drawing on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience. We are incredibly grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us in our podcast as we seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community and contribute to its success by bringing research and practice closer together. We want to make sure this is the most useful and insightful ERP podcast you listen to, and we'd love your help in doing so by leaving us feedback and a review. A great place to do so is at Apple Podcasts. Just click on the Listen in Apple Podcasts link, then click Ratings and Reviews, and let us know your thoughts. You can get more info about the show, including show notes and episode highlights for this and all of our episodes, by visiting nestleandassociates.com and clicking the podcast option. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. And don't forget to follow us on social media, #the ERP OCJ. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic week.